right, hello guys. This video is going to go along with your photosynthesis and cellular respiration notes. So in your cell notes packet, this should be the last section in the packet. So far we've talked about the structure of cells, cellular processes, how transport, so how things move in and out of the cell. And then starting today, we're going to start focusing on basically what fuels cells. So there's two different processes we're going to learn about. And I kind of think of it as like one process fuels plant cells, and then the other fuels all the other cells, like animal cells. So every other cell, like every cell in our body. And these two processes are called photosynthesis and cellular respiration. Okay, so when we look at cell power, everything that our cells do require energy, right? So cells, in order for cells to repair themselves, to grow, to reproduce, just functioning requires energy. So photosynthesis is absolutely crucial to life because that photosynthesis is the process of plants converting solar energy into what we call glucose. Okay, so remember that. So plants are taking energy from the sun and then producing this product called glucose, which is really a sugar molecule. Then respiration, which is occurring in our cells, is crucial to life, and our cells are converting that glucose from the plants, you guys, to ATP. And you should be familiar with the term ATP because that is the form of energy that our cells can use. So what we see right here on the slide is huge. So basically, plants photosynthesize, they take energy from the sun, produce glucose. We eat 3 meals a day. We get glucose. We eat that glucose, and then our individual cells in the mitochondria take the glucose and produce ATP, which is the molecule that our cells can use for energy, and that's the ticket, right? So then the question is, where do we get the glucose in our food? Well, if we eat a salad, we eat the glucose directly from those plant cells, right? So as a vegetarian would get all of their glucose from plant sources. If you eat a hamburger, you're getting glucose from the beef that you ate, and the beef got its glucose from the grass that cow ate, right? So we get all of our glucose from our diet. Energy storage. So the problem is cells actually don't have the ability to store a lot of ATP, which is the energy that the cells can use, right? So actually most of the energy in our body is stored as glucose. And we're going to start by looking at photosynthesis. So we know that photosynthesis occurs in plants. So this is the process that autotrophs use to convert solar energy from the sun into food energy, which is what we call glucose. This occurs in the chloroplast of cells. We learned about chloroplasts briefly in the beginning of this unit when we talked about organelles. So we know that chloroplasts are the green organelles. Chloroplasts are shaped kind of like a pill, like a long skinny pill or vitamin or something. And within the chloroplast is this funny little network of things. So there's like these stacks of things that look like pancakes, and they're kind of interconnected, and that's where photosynthesis is happening. If we take a closer look here, what we see is stacks of these green-looking pancakes. A light from energy from the sun is going to pass through, and you'll notice that if you look at the light spectrum, because we're going to talk about this a lot. So if you look at the light spectrum here that's coming from the sun, you can see that basically all the colors of the rainbow, right? Some of those colors are going to be absorbed, and some of those are going to be what we call reflected. The chloroplast is going to absorb all colors and reflect the color that we see, essentially. And you can see here that this chloroplast is actually going to be reflecting green light, which is why it appears to be green. So it's absorbing all of the colors except green. And we'll talk more about this. Here we can see, so there's a couple different kinds of chlorophyll, which is the green pigment, but there's also different colored pigments. So it's like if you have a beautiful green tree in your front yard, a beautiful tree in your front yard, and during the growing season it's green, right? The leaves are green. But in the fall, all of a sudden things change. And all of a sudden those green leaves now turn, let's say, a really beautiful yellow. What you're actually seeing is a different pigment that's been there all along, but essentially think of it as the green pigments kind of overpower the yellow or orangey color. That pigment is called the carotenoids. And the carotenoids, again, are just pigments that are like yellow and orangey colored. So really quick, what you see here, let's look at the carotenoids. So this graph is just showing the wavelength. And you can see this is including like all the colors of the rainbow. And every light that we see has a specific wavelength. So the y-axis here is representing the absorption of the light. So let's look at the carotenoids. When we appear to see, at lower wavelengths, carotenoids are like highly absorbed, right? But all of a sudden around 520-ish maybe, the carotenoids are no longer absorbed and they're reflected, which is when we would see their color, for example. Here's another interesting picture or kind of illustration of the inside of a chloroplast. So again, you can see these green looking things. Each individual green pancake is called a thylakoid. A stack of thylakoid is called a grana. And then all this like gray, kind of like the fluid on the inside is called stroma. So we have thylakoids that create granas, and then the stuff inside is called stroma. Okay, so let's look at the cellular, like the chemical reaction and the cellular process of photosynthesis. So the reactants, and these are the three things that must be present in order for photosynthesis to occur. Number one, solar energy, so energy from the sun. Number two, carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And then three is water. The products of photosynthesis are glucose, that sugar molecule we talked about, and oxygen. Okay, so with the equation, remember the reactants. So we must have carbon dioxide. Remember, plants just get that from the atmosphere. Water, energy from the sun. Those three things react in the chloroplast and produce glucose. Notice that this glucose is a big carbon molecule. And oxygen. So you're not going to have to memorize this specific, like you're not going to have to rewrite this exact equation, but you're going to have to be familiar with the fact that CO2 is carbon dioxide and H2O is water. And glucose is this big old carbon molecule. And of course, you should know O2 is oxygen. Okay, so remember, photosynthesis changed the world. So long time ago, there was all of a sudden this huge dramatic change in the climate on Earth when photosynthetic organisms appeared. And again, and we think that these first photosynthetic organisms were not plants. They were actually probably like photosynthetic bacteria, like really tiny photosynthetic organisms, right? Not like a big plant all of a sudden just starts growing. We think that it was like a photosynthetic bacteria, like a tiny little organism that started to photosynthesize. And then ever since then, it became or gradually, photosynthesis has become more efficient. And then gradually, different organisms began to evolve. So these are original photosynthetic organisms, used carbon dioxide and produced oxygen. So this was the first time, you guys, that oxygen was actually started to be produced and released into the atmosphere. So now all of a sudden on Earth's atmosphere, we see a huge increase in the oxygen concentration. So it was less than 1% of the oxygen made up less than 1% of the Earth's atmosphere. And then all of a sudden, we have photosynthetic organisms becoming more and more prevalent, more and more efficient. And currently about 21% of the atmosphere is oxygen. Sorry. Okay. Now let's switch gears and move on to cellular respiration. So remember, what we've seen happen is energy from the sun gets photosynthesized and plants produce glucose. We, animals, eat the glucose and that fuels our bodies. And what we're going to learn today, most people have no clue happens, how our body actually takes food energy and produce cellular energy. And the process is called cellular respiration. So cellular respiration is the process that all organisms use to convert food energy in the form of glucose into a usable energy, which we know is called ATP. This occurs in the mitochondria. And if you recall from the beginning of the unit, mitochondria is, you guys call it like the powerhouse of the cell, right? And it's true. And it's because that's where this process occurs. So in those mitochondria, there's just tons of cellular respiration occurring. The reactants for cellular respiration is that glucose, so the energy molecule from our food, and oxygen. So we have to breathe and we have to eat in order to fuel our cells. So glucose and oxygen are the only two reactants. The products are carbon dioxide, which we exhale, water, and that energy molecule ATP. So let's look at the big picture here. Let's look at the whole equation. There's that glucose molecule. So that same glucose molecule that the plants are producing, we now eat. We breathe in oxygen. So the only two reactants for respiration. In our little mitochondria, those two react together and produce carbon dioxide, water, and energy. And remember, the energy is in the form of ATP. Can't remember if I have it on a slide, but remember ATP is just short for this big molecule called adenosine triphosphate. But you don't have to remember it. Okay. There's two types of respiration. One is called aerobic. So think aerobic, think air. And that occurs when oxygen is present. So like most of the time, right? Almost your entire life, your cells are going to undergo aerobic respiration. So every time that you have adequate oxygen, which would be pretty much all the time, you're going to be undergoing aerobic respiration. The second type is when there is no oxygen present. And an example of anaerobic is fermentation. So let's first look at aerobic. So remember, aerobic is with plenty of air, so there is oxygen present. Aerobic respiration is really efficient. Our cells are really good at undergoing aerobic respiration, and producing lots of energy particles. So if you look at this, remember 36. Okay, so basically one cycle of aerobic respiration produces 36 ATP. Remember that number. So this is the most efficient process by far. And again, remember, our cells almost always undergo aerobic respiration because in our atmosphere, most of the time, we're just getting plenty of oxygen. Anaerobic respiration is when cells lack oxygen. So when cells are not getting enough oxygen to undergo the process, then they kind of switch gears to anaerobic. This is way less efficient. In fact, look how many, so one cycle of anaerobic respiration only produces 2 ATP. If you remember, if I go back a slide, aerobic respiration produces 36. So you can see how much more efficient aerobic is because it produces 36 ATP compared to only 2 with the anaerobic respiration. There's 2 types of fermentation. So when we look at anaerobic respiration, where the heck is this occurring? One example is alcoholic fermentation, which truly is like the process used to produce alcohol, and yeast in bread. So if you've ever like made a bread that actually has to like sit and rise, that is an example of anaerobic respiration. The one that occurs in our body is called lactic acid fermentation. And this occurs in our muscle cells when they don't receive enough oxygen. So this is like when you're exercising or you're working your muscles really hard. So you go for a long run or you go lift weights. In the moment that if you're running really hard, if your individual cells are not getting enough oxygen, they can't undergo aerobic respiration. So they switch gears, desperate to try to make any energy for your cell. They switch gears to anaerobic. In our bodies, this is called lactic acid fermentation. And one of the products is literally lactic acid. And so if you work out really hard, let's imagine that some of your leg muscle cells have undergone lactic acid fermentation. The next day or two, you might start to feel really sore. If you've ever had sore muscles, that is the lactic acid present in your muscle cells. That's why they feel sore. So again, most of the time our bodies are undergoing aerobic respiration unless you're working muscle cells really hard. They're not getting enough oxygen and they undergo lactic acid fermentation. So let's do a quick overview. This whole process begins with the sun, right? So we have energy from the sun that is radiated towards the plants. Plants photosynthesize, so they take energy from the sun and produce that glucose molecule. So if we're only tracking energy, we have energy from the sun being converted to glucose. Glucose is eaten by animals. Animals like us go through respiration. And then the end goal is to transform glucose into ATP, which then can fuel our individual cellular activities, right? So those ATP molecules might be going towards cellular division. It might just be going towards healing your cells. It might be going towards active transport, which we talked about. So there's all types of things that our cells need and depend on energy for. And that's it. Okay, so this should complete your entire cell notes packet. And now for the next couple of days, we're going to take a closer look at photosynthesis and respiration.